Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. My name is Vasuki Nesea, and I'll be moderating this panel. Let me begin with some thank yous. First, of course, thanks in advance to our panelists. We greatly appreciate your participation in this conversation and our appreciation also to the translators who will be providing simultaneous translation in Tamil and Sinhalese. My thanks also, of course, to Women and Media Collective, who are co-sponsoring this event, Taranga, who has taken care of all the logistics, but also Kumi and Sepali, sort of long-term collaborators. This session is a second in a series we've been working on in relation to the economic crisis. The last one was focused on a human rights approach to IMF negotiations, and I will put a link for that in the chat for those of you who missed it. This is a perilous time in Sri Lanka where the government is cracking down on the right to dissent, and many of the student leaders and labor organizers of the protests over the past months have been threatened, arrested, or worse. Clearly, their aim is to shrink the space for public debate and accountability. But what the protesters gave us, those in Sri Lanka and elsewhere, was precisely a broadening of that political space. Goigodagama was about the fact that times of crisis needed more conversation and more debate, not less. They opened up a conversation about the crisis in Sri Lanka, how we got here, and directions going forward. So this panel is convened in that spirit and in solidarity with the protesters. There is a reigning orthodoxy about how to deal with economic crisis. The moves the government in Sri Lanka is taking right now, privatizing the utilities, implementing austerity programs, and the like, are working within that orthodoxy. And hopefully today's conversations can be one step in helping us to think more creatively about alternative directions. We have a wonderful panel to help us in that, and I'm not going to take time away from their interventions through extensive interventions. You can Google them. The plan is that each speaker will speak for 10 to 15 minutes. I will then pose some follow-up questions, and after that, we will open it up to your questions. So please feel free to type in your questions into the chat, and we'll take those up. We will begin with Ahilan Kadirgama, a political economist and senior lecturer at the University of Jaffna. He has been very engaged with these conversations in Sri Lanka, so probably doesn't need an introduction. Those of you in Sri Lanka would have read and heard from him quite a lot over the past months. Next, we will have Anthony Angie, who is a law professor at the National University of Singapore and the University of Utah College of Law. Tony is a scholar of international law, legal history, and third world approaches to international law, including international law and development. He's, of course, also from Sri Lanka and will be speaking to us from Colombo. Then we will hear from Anna Gelpan, who is also a legal scholar and expert on sovereign debt and financial regulation. She's professor at the Georgetown University Law Center and a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Our last speaker will be Sanjay Reddy, professor and chair of economics at the New School for Social Research, who has expertise in development economics and a range of other subjects. He has followed political and economic developments in Sri Lanka for many years. Finally, with a reminder to everyone, myself included, I realized I probably didn't follow this advice, but with a reminder to everyone that we need to speak slowly for the translators to do their job. With that, let me turn it over to Ahilan.
Okay, thank you, Vasi, and thanks also for the Women and Media Collective for continuing with these kinds of discussions, which are much needed. I think my role might be to kind of set up the kind of context and some questions also for the panelists. So one, the way I see this, even the title of our webinar, Sovereign Debt, IMF Negotiations and Economic Crisis, as a topic full of contradictions. And I hope to kind of, open up these contradictions here. And obviously at the heart of this discussion is unsustainable sovereign debt, but also the first ever default by Sri Lanka of its sovereign debt. And in the meantime, we are working towards or negotiating towards the 17th IMF agreement. We've had 16 already since 1965. And somehow the first ever default is going to be solved, including the economic crisis, by the 17th IMF agreement. That's how it's being framed often in the public sphere in Sri Lanka. But the crisis in Sri Lanka, however, is much broader than sovereign debt. And at least the sort of immediate lead up to it over the last 2 years, I argue, is really about our current account deficit. It's a problem of much larger imports than exports, along with our incapacity to pay back our debt. And how we got there is through decades of trade liberalization and financialization in the form of opening up our capital account convertibility. And such liberalization is what the IMF has been pushing us since structural adjustment and the open economy reforms in the late 1970s. So there itself is a contradiction, where I would argue it's the path that we have taken, pushed by the IMF, that has gotten us here. And how could that be solved through the same sort of recipes that the IMF is continuing to put forward? Now, I'll talk about two things mainly. This approach of going to the IMF, not just whether or not we're going to the IMF, but how we are approaching it, and the whole question of default. Now, sometime earlier this year, the government decided to go to the IMF for negotiations. And what's quite clear to us now is that they've been implementing many of the recommendations of the IMF, particularly those that came out into the public domain in their last staff report, which was made public in March. So with that, for example, interest rates in Sri Lanka have been increased from 6% to 15.5%. We've floated the rupee. So the rupee has gone up, devalued from 200 rupees to $1 to now about 360 rupees to $1. Now, they've also called for the market pricing of energy. We've seen petrol and diesel prices almost triple. And 2 days ago, it was announced that the price of kerosene oil is going to be almost fourfold. We've seen austerity measures across the board. Government spending has been reduced. Now, these were all clearly specified in the IMF staff report, and that came about also at a time in April when Sri Lanka announced publicly that it's going to default on its external debt on the order of $51 billion US. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about the interconnection between the two, but the consequence of defaulting on our external debt is that now we no longer can seem to get any kind of even bridge financing, including from our larger bilateral donors, whether it's China or Japan. Not only that, most of these large bilateral donors have also put a halt to the ongoing development projects that they've been involved in. So Japan has said that they're going to halt construction of the Katunaka airport terminal, so many of these projects. So all of this together in the last few months has led to the Sri Lankan economy into free fall. The central bank governor a few days ago announced that we're going to look at an 8% contraction of GDP this year. I mean, this is unprecedented. This is the kind of thing that happens during the Great Depression, and we haven't seen anything like this. And I think the consequences of this kind of a contraction and the devastation that it's going to leave behind, we are hardly taking cognizance of. Now, what was the logic in terms of the timing of the default in April? What was announced then is that we needed something like $78 million US in debt repayment further down that month. But why were they in such a hurry? Every month, Sri Lanka's foreign earnings amount to on the order of 1,300 million US dollars if there were certain incentives given to increase the remittances that come in. It could even go up to 1,500, 1,600 million US dollars. So what was the logic of defaulting in April for a payment of 72 million US dollars? The next sovereign bond payment was due in July, in late July, on the order of 1 billion US dollars. What was the rush all about? I would argue there was a belief among the policymakers, there was also push by some in the Colombo establishment, the think tanks, that a default would somehow then lock us into an IMF agreement, that we would have no other way out, and it would accelerate the IMF agreement. And they were also of the view that, which I think is completely flawed, that we can default and then again go back and borrow in the capital markets soon enough after debt restructuring and an IMF agreement. I think all of this is proving to be quite disastrous, the kind of path that we are on. The IMF agreement, which, at different points when Ranil Wickremesinghe was prime minister, he said end of July, end of August. Now they keep shifting the milepost to now they're saying end of the year, possibly early next year. And in the meantime, we don't qualify for any kind of loans from even bilateral donors because we didn't try to negotiate with them, but went for a hard default. And now we are caught in this trap. And this idea that you can default and then again go back to the capital market. So if you are taking a strong kind of perhaps a different view of our external finances, and if we are defaulting and saying, okay, we are not going to go for any more external loans, it would be a different issue. But here was this idea that we could default. The problem was, of course, this excessive amount of sovereign borrowing, particularly sovereign bonds, and then again go back to it. Now, this kind of the miscalculation of this strategy of going to the IMF and also defaulting on our debt has now pushed us into a position where we have no negotiating power. We are desperately seeking an IMF agreement, and the IMF is also playing hardball. They're saying, well, first go and restructure your debt with your creditors, and including China, and only after that we would disperse the funds. Whereas the Colombo establishment always has taken the position that the Sri Lankan policymakers are not capable of charting an economic policy path forward, that we have to follow a solution given by the IMF. It's only with an IMF solution that we would also be able to repay our debt. But now we are caught in this chicken and egg situation where the IMF is saying, first go and negotiate with your creditors with a plan, and then we will give it to you. On the other hand, the creditors could possibly argue, well, what guarantee do we have without an IMF agreement? So we are caught in this trap. And of course, I think there is something deeper going on in terms of a geopolitical game at stake here as well, where the IMF, backed by certain Western powers, including, I would argue, the US Treasury, are putting the brakes on it for a number of reasons. One, they're not sure about the stability of the government, whether signing an agreement would actually be, would lead to a future government accepting it, given the sort of political cycles that we've seen in Sri Lanka already. But more importantly, Sri Lanka is the first in a number of countries that are likely to default. And what would China's strategy be in terms of debt restructuring? So Sri Lanka becomes, in essence, the guinea pig for experimentation on this path forward. But by way of kind of concluding this short presentation, I want to say at the heart of this is this myth of a final solution with this 17th IMF agreement, that this is the sort of mother of all solution to Sri Lanka's economic woes. And at whatever cost, if we accept the IMF agreement, as I mentioned, already our economy is in free fall. I do research in the rural areas in the north. In many villages, people are only eating one meal a day. And this tremendous suffering and the kind of austerity that we have already undertaken in the hope of getting this IMF agreement, which is only likely to get worse, being pushed on the people on this idea that this is the solution. Now, what would be the way forward? I would argue that there's no guarantee that an IMF agreement is going to come anytime soon. And even if it does, it might only lead to further suffering with austerity. And we hear both the Prime Minister and even opposition parliamentarians saying we have to swallow a bitter pill of the IMF agreement and austerity. None of them are going to swallow any bitter pill. It's the working people in Sri Lanka that are going to suffer. And there is increasingly, with the counter-revolution of Ranil Wickremesinghe, we are seeing a class divide that is becoming much more visible in terms of sections of the Colombo elite siding with him. And what was maybe seen as a much broader revolt, now certain lines of division are also becoming clear. So just to end, I would say that the path forward is not the one that the IMF has already charted. We are going to have to manage with whatever foreign earnings we can get, whether it's through our export earnings or foreign remittances from our citizens who work abroad, and to restrict imports to essentials such as fuel, food, medicines, and the inputs necessary for production and exports. Because there's no, I have little faith that we'll be able to again go on the borrowing binge that led to this crisis, because that's the kind of solution that the IMF path entails. And the global conditions are also very different in terms of the rise of rising interest rates set by various central banks around the world. We would, of course, in addition to managing our economy and trying to keep it from going to free fall, have fiscal stimulus on the part of the state, because the private sector has lost all confidence and it's not going to invest, and otherwise we'll see the free fall. And that would require redistribution, possibly a wealth tax. That would be the bitter pill that the elite in Sri Lanka would have to swallow, which they don't even want to talk about. And then we would have to start thinking about a different kind of built environment, focusing on the much broader sections of society, our rural economy, and so on, to be able to move forward. But that trajectory, that economic trajectory, is antithetical to the economic trajectory being set by the IMF. And I think that would ultimately determine the game by people's struggles and really a class struggle in terms of which way the people of Sri Lanka decide to choose. Thank you.
Thanks, Ahilan. Tony?
So let me thank Ahilan and Vasuki for beginning this whole dialogue, and for the Women's Collective for supporting this whole project. So Ahilan addressed this issue in terms of the economics of the whole question of the IMF involvement in Sri Lanka. I thought I would perhaps deal with some of the legal aspects that we might consider when thinking about this whole question of sovereign debt and some of the different actors involved in this whole process. We might also see, what's very interesting in recent times is how Sri Lanka is seen as, in a sense, as being exemplary in many respects. And there's a continuous coverage of this issue of, for example, Bangladesh, are we going the way of Sri Lanka? Pakistan, are we going the way of Sri Lanka? Is Sri Lanka the first in just a series of defaults that we might be experiencing? And, looking at this more broadly, we can think of the whole question of the role of debt in the management of international affairs, and the role of debt as a way in which power might be exercised, and certain countries, certain actors might actually expand their power to using the particular technology of debt. It's very interesting, for instance, that there's a great deal of discussion about the Hambantota port and the Chinese debt trap. But much earlier in Sri Lanka's history, we had a treaty between the King of Kandy and the Dutch. And the basic agreement was that the Dutch would help the King of Kandy get rid of the Portuguese. And in return, the King of Kandy would pay the Portuguese certain amounts. And the Dutch claimed that the amounts were not paid, as a result of which the King of Kandy was in debt. And as a result of this, the basic claim was by the Dutch that we have the right to take over all these different ports of Sri Lanka. So we can see debt is, a place of affair. So it's very interesting to think of that episode in the context of what is happening now. Simply to point out that debt has always been a mechanism of international control, international politics. And we might see this as being yet another example of all that taking place. Let me now shift to a different question. And that question is somewhat similar to the issue that Ahilan raises. I think what is quite extraordinary here is the way in which in Colombo, in Sri Lanka in general, the IMF is seen as the savior. Everything is focused, everything is concentrated on getting that IMF package together. And we might think about this in economic terms as the IMF package providing us with a solution to Sri Lanka's economic problems. And Ahilan, I suppose, has provided us with a response to that argument. But what also interests me is the argument that somehow the IMF might restructure the Sri Lankan political system itself in order to improve the governance of the Sri Lankan political system. Now, surely nobody can have any doubt at all about the corruption, the nepotism, the sheer incompetence that we see as such a defining feature of Sri Lankan governance. And it's very interesting, even in the statement of the Women's Collective, which is on your website, how, as a result of this dialogue between the IMF and various civil society actors, there are a series of requests about what the IMF should be requiring in terms of transparency, accountability, an open system in terms of how the economy should be managed, the availability of information to get all that being done. And at the same time, there's an appeal for the IMF package to also include all these provisions of social protection. So the interesting question from a legal point of view is, what are the powers of the IMF in terms of actually engaging in these types of activities? Can the IMF take into account human rights issues? Can the IMF advance the rule of law to restructure the Sri Lankan polity in the way that people hope might be the case, to replace all the incompetence and corruption? So here, the basic argument is, if we look at the Articles of Agreement of the IMF, and also in a similar way in the World Bank, which has a slightly different approach, the basic argument is that, or the basic position of these constitutions is that the IMF should not get involved in any political activities. All the IMF should do is try as best it can to meet the purposes of the IMF as defined in its Articles of Agreement, Article 1. So, there's a question immediately: what will be the response of the IMF to hyper-suppression of protests in Sri Lanka at present? Now here I would say I don't know, but all I would say is that under the Articles of Agreement, as they have been interpreted historically, the IMF does not really care. The IMF is not concerned about freedom of speech. It is not concerned about the suppression of protest. All it is concerned about is making sure that the economic programs that it actually prescribes will be implemented properly, and that the IMF resources will be preserved, as it were. So, so we have this interesting situation. I don't want to go into the detail about the Articles of Agreement and so forth. The World Bank has a slightly different approach. The World Bank has explicit provision in its Articles of Agreement prohibiting interference in the political affairs of a state. So I would say that the IMF, from a legal point of view, it might decide differently from a policy point of view, depending on the circumstances. But from a strictly legal point of view, all it has to do is to say, we don't care if there is suppression, as long as the purposes of the IMF are met. And so we might have this interesting combination, and I don't think we'll even get to that point, of what I would call, or what a colleague has called, the authoritarian rule of law. And by the authoritarian rule of law, what is really meant is a system in which there might be all these you could say, developments leading to the so-called rule of law being applied to the economic sphere. But that doesn't necessarily lead to political rights being protected. And so authoritarian regimes can be most effective in actually implementing IMF programs. It's all a question about whether the local government, running Wickremesinghe, is able to keep the population in check in such a way, and the protests in check in such a way as to enable these programs to take place, to be implemented. That is the legal point of view. I don't know what might unfold from a policy level, because it's also notable that in more recent times, the IMF has been presenting itself as much more sensitive to social concerns and to various types of hardship and trying to provide for safety nets and so forth. But it's sobering to read, the UNCTAD reports about debt and the role of the IMF in this whole structure, because the UNCTAD report, is rather critical about what the IMF does. And these organizations are superb in terms of the rhetoric they present, as far as their concern for human rights and so forth are concerned. So that's one set of comments about the legal dimensions. The other set of comments about the legal dimensions have to do with really the complexity of the debt negotiations. And here I'm going to rely on Anna's expertise, but I really wonder whether there are any debt negotiations which are quite as complex that have taken place as the debt negotiations that Sri Lanka faces. Now, the fascinating thing here is, as Ahilan points out, the IMF says you've got to sort things out with your creditors, before we can get a proper package in place. Imagine that situation where a country is completely at the mercy of its creditors, and the creditors have very different approaches, very different interests in these types of circumstances. So it's going to be a really difficult negotiation. We've got China, we've got BlackRock, we've got such a range of different actors. And here the interesting question to me is the way in which these different actors might leverage legal systems in order to try and enhance their own positions. So we know that the Hamilton Bank has commenced proceedings in New York, and we can see this as part of an attempt to sort of enhance its own bargaining position. Now, the complication here is that there are a number of other legal regimes which might also come into play. So, for example, in recent times, we have a system of foreign investment law or bilateral investment treaties being used to actually address the question by investors to actually try and again protect their own assets. So the complication is we've got multiple complex legal regimes which might present these actors as a mechanism to pursue their own interests and leverage their own interests in different ways. And there is no coordination between these legal regimes. And this situation is completely unlike something like a domestic bankruptcy, where once you declare bankruptcy, you get some kind of minimal protection that will give you some breathing space to try and deal in a systematic way with your creditors. So, so we might find, the foreign investment regime playing a role in all this. Some of the actors deciding to try and sue, And I can't give you the details because we have to look at the particular bilateral investment treaties and the terms, and whether you could say that debt can be characterized within the terms of those treaties. But in Sri Lanka, we surely know what the consequences of these treaties would be. We're all familiar with the oil hedging scandal, which cost Sri Lanka millions of dollars, and that was an action that was taken under a bilateral investment treaty, the Deutsche Bank case. So that's another aspect of the legal. It's not just the economics that are really messy. It is the different legal structures, the different legal regimes in place, which really complicate the economic dimensions of the whole thing as well. So I do think the two things need to be considered in conjunction with each other. Okay. Let me see if I've got anything else to add to some of these things. Well, if we are talking about legal structures, I can't help noting that the IMF, we are hoping for accountability and transparency and so forth. There's very little accountability of the IMF to anything like the larger structures of international law. So the IMF is under no obligation to comply with international human rights law, for instance. And these organizations were created very deliberately in 1944, before the United Nations, before the human rights treaties and so forth. They were deliberately created to be their own world, independent of all the other international law developments that might actually shape a different sort of response and would compel the IMF to actually take into account human rights considerations. So let me just say in closing, we can think about debt in all these different ways. There seems to be this interesting dynamic where in order to actually emerge as a legal personality, you actually have to incur massive debt. We can think of the Haiti case. Once Haiti becomes independent, having fought against the French Empire, Haiti finds itself having to face this massive debt, which in various ways cripples its later development. We can see this at a micro level. Maybe maybe this organization has also looked at this whole question about the indebtedness of women in the north in Sri Lanka, whereas once the war began, all the financial institutions rushed in, microfinance with all its allure and all its attractiveness, all its claims about empowerment. And you find this whole problem of debt at a very micro level, leading to massive hardship, suffering, and many suicides. So I do think there is a kind of relationship in broader terms that we can see between that micro, you could say, domination of debt in those circumstances and these larger circumstances. Let me just focus on the word sovereign debt. Sovereignty has been at the heart of so much of this discussion. And I can't help feeling that one of the reasons that we are here is because Sri Lankan sovereignty has been understood in a fundamentally mistaken and dangerous way. And it is a form of sovereignty that has been, from its very inception, racialized. And anybody familiar with Sri Lankan history is completely aware of this, the role of race and the claim that we are the great protectors of the Sinhalese people. The role of that in the politics of Sri Lanka, where there's been a sort of escalating nationalism, where people have to make this sort of claim in order to win elections. And this was surely the case with Gotabaya Rajapaksa as well. So we can see this as well. And of course, it's so ironic that the person who presents himself as a protector of Sri Lankan sovereignty should devastate Sri Lankan sovereignty or be the head of state of Sri Lanka at a point where that sovereignty is so decimated. And Sri Lanka is reduced to such a completely abject state, as Aylan points out. It is unprecedented. And you can't have a feeling that one of the reasons that Gotabaya Rajapaksa was overwhelmingly elected, despite everybody knowing that there was a whole background of violence and corruption involved, is because of these claims to be the great protector. And so racism has had a massively destructive impact of Sri Lanka in this respect as well, because sovereignty has been seen in such a narrow way, rather than this whole broader question of how can we live as one people, regardless of race. So this is why I think the Aragalaya is amazing. It is entirely inspiring. I know there's a debate that is taking place in Sri Lanka right now about whether the Aragalaya achieved anything else or not. But I really do feel that Aragalaya at least tried to reverse that dynamic, to present a different vision of Sri Lanka, of what Sri Lanka could be. and it has to be admired for that reason. I really fear for what is going to happen in Sri Lanka in these types of circumstances. I hope I'm wrong. Thanks.
Thanks, Tony. Anna?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Vasuki, and thanks to the Women's Collective and everyone here for including me in this conversation. I want to start with two disclaimers. One is that I have zero expertise on Sri Lanka, and I am not an economist. So I will pull some threads from Ahilan's and Tony's remarks and try to flesh out a bit the institutional context in which this crisis is unfolding. And in particular, I think it's important, and really I took from the title of our panel, is to try to figure out what can be done now that we are where we are. And in particular, if in fact Sri Lanka continues on this path of negotiating a program with the IMF, how can the people of Sri Lanka use the IMF to minimize, mitigate the damage from the crisis, perhaps secure more just distribution outcomes and a more sustainable development path from here on. So I think that Tony put his finger on it early on in his remarks when he highlighted debt as an institution that has been used historically and is structurally designed for power projection. All right, and I think your closing with the theme of sovereignty is also very important in that respect. And the interesting thing from my perspective, I study sovereign debt and financial regulation, among other things. And there is a widespread misconception, I think, that debt crisis negotiations, debt restructuring negotiations are a debtor-creditor proposition. In some ways, the task is to recognize that it's really more of an intercreditor proposition, but that idea does not mean that the debtor has no agency, right? It just means that the debtor has a fixed amount of resources available for the creditors, and then the creditors are fighting it out among themselves for whatever allocation comes out of the crisis. And so from my perspective, the task really for the people of Sri Lanka is to A, preserve resources, maximize the envelope of resources available for domestic recovery, stabilization, and, again, I'm not an economist, be it restoring the balance of payments or, fiscal balance, or perhaps more importantly, a just development path, but then use the IMF to help coordinate the intercreditor battles, for lack of a better word, over the remaining pot of resources, right? And so, because unless it's done in that broad framework, what happens is every creditor can come back to get a payment, a little bit of something on the side out of the resources that really should be available and dedicated to domestic recovery and development purposes, right? Picking up one more point that Tony made, Sri Lanka's debt stock is indeed extremely complex. And foreign debt, foreign currency, foreign creditors is roughly half. But there is also a big stock of domestic debt. And I gather that recently there have been statements about about including domestic debt in the restructuring. And about half of the domestic debt is held by domestic banks and pension funds and various savings vehicles that, of course, could, if that debt is restructured, that would harm the solvency of banks and other domestic institutions and ultimately come out of the pocket of domestic constituencies. It could be the elites, but it could also be the middle class and poor. So that's something I think that's important to keep an eye on. Now, pulling back, there are a number of ways in which we could think about in which to kind of slice and dice this debt stock. There is the official bilateral and multilateral debts, the debt owed to public sector agencies, institutions, that would be IMF, World Bank, but also the governments of Japan, India, and China in that order. There is private commercial debt, which has grown tremendously over the past decade. Then there's domestic and external debt, which I mentioned already. There are many ways to define this. There's the local currency, foreign currency, but also local holders, foreign holders, and local law, foreign law, right? So it is mechanically easier to restructure domestic law, domestic currency debt. That's where the government has the most flexibility, the most sovereignty, if you will. But of course, that also is the most, the part that is arguably most accountable to domestic constituents, which I think is makes it usually incredibly politically sensitive, and also it's just more salient. There is a lot of contingent debt and a lot of debt that is owed by state-owned enterprises. There's also some central bank debt that may or may not be dealt with the same way as direct government debt. There is secured and unsecured debt. Of course, the Hambantota port conversation highlighted not just for Sri Lanka, but for everybody, the rise in secured sovereign debt and the possible implications of that, without going into the merits of that particular case study, which I think is pretty complicated. To me, the issue is that we need to understand not just what the government owes, but also what public assets are effectively tied up in these borrowing arrangements, right? So the problem is not just that the government owes too much money to somebody, but also that it may have already yielded control over its resources and assets. And those types of arrangements tend to be complex and hard to diagnose. I mean, this is where a lot of the debates between the IMF and governments and civil society and governments kind of unfold. Is this debt or is this a forward commodity sale, for example? Is this a loan or a lease? And that's something that I think makes it kind of hard to deal with. Okay, so this is complicated, and whether the IMF is in the picture or not, it would require an enormous amount of monitoring and coordination. right? So it is in every single creditor's interest to get a side deal that is better than another creditor's deal. And these are not shy folks, nor are they operating out of benevolence, even sadly, if the debt is labeled concessional or development debt. So that is something I think that the IMF can certainly and has in the past performed a coordination role. I think that there are very valid questions about what is the price of that coordination function. But I think the task is really, how do you leverage what IMF presence there might be to ensure that the intercreditor negotiation unfolds in such a way that does not impose social costs, again, on the domestic economy. I want to pull back and comment just in closing on a couple of things that both Tony and Ahilan have mentioned so far. First, the IMF's role in debt negotiations as it has evolved over the past, I don't know, 3 decades and change, is actually somewhat complicated and could very much be used to the borrowing country's advantage. Again, I think it's a valid debate to ask what cost conditionality. But you do not have to restructure all of your debt before you get an IMF program. What the IMF asks for is, what the IMF has to, its requirement is financing assurances. So it needs to have some sort of credible assurance that it's that the program, 2 years, 3 years now, they can be a bit longer, will in fact be financed. And that can be with new money, it can be with restructuring. It does not have to be with restructuring one particular bucket of debt versus another. So, we've recently had some very interesting cases involving some creditors that the countries have in common. Suriname is worth looking at, where really the question is how much certainty does there have to be in the financing assurances for the program to get ahead? That's a point for negotiation, but that's how it's framed. In fact, the fund has a policy it's called completely impenetrably lending into arrears policy. That's a policy that was designed to take away creditor leverage, sort of effective creditor veto power over IMF disbursements, right? So that the IMF is allowed and does lend to countries in default, provided that the country and its creditors are engaged in good faith negotiations, et cetera, et cetera. Again, too weedy to bother with here. But again, there is a ton of room for Sri Lanka to use the IMF to its advantage, although I do think that there is a cost, and that cost is important to debate. With that, the word default, which I think Ahilan focused on properly, but where I think we may not be on the same page. I'm not an economist, but I do think that it is valid to ask whether Sri Lanka's loss of new financing is because of default or because of debt overhang, and whether new borrowing on whatever terms is a solution to the problems facing Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has been on the teetering on the brink list, and it has been #1 on that list for years. It was the one country that stood out in all of the charts around March 2020, when the pandemic broke out, as having an unsustainable debt stock and debt payment profile. And that was before we had rising interest rates all over the world and money whooshing out of developing countries to get more juice from the United States, Europe, the UK, and other comfy places. So whether, and by the same token, default is a very murky legal construct, and whether China, Japan, India, whoever would lend despite pension suspended payments to them or others, whether they would refinance, I think is also a matter for negotiation. So in closing, I think that the focus should be on maximizing agency. The IMF may or may not have explicit human rights responsibilities. There's a pretty big debate in literature about that. But the IMF cannot, under its own rules, lend into a program that is about to implode on itself. That's certainly been a realization coming out of the Asian financial crisis in 98, 99, et cetera. So a socially sustainable program is something that should be the goal, and something that I think is within reach. And then using the IMF for the formidable task of intercreditor coordination, mindful of the role of domestic debt and domestic autonomy in politics. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. And now our last speaker, Sanjay Reddy.
Hello, good evening. Or good morning. I think a lot has been said already by the other speakers who are much more expert on both the local conditions in Sri Lanka and the particular history which led up to the present situation, and also, of course, the legal and institutional aspects, especially as pertaining to the international system, of which both Tony and Anna are certainly real experts. But I will try to add a little bit to the conversation as that lowly creature called an economist, which many of you have quite sensibly said that you are not, right, quite appropriately distancing yourself from. I would like to show you some of the facts, as far as I've been able to uncover them, about the evolution of the Sri Lankan situation and the current dilemma that Sri Lanka faces, with a mind to focusing on practical solutions and considerations that the Sri Lankan people and government could have in mind in the near to medium term. So much as there are very serious and profound questions about how the international system has evolved in the way that it has, and has chronically failed to be reformed and calls out for reform, especially as regards sovereign debt resolution mechanisms, leading to this recurrent situation of countries in crisis, currently Sri Lanka. I will not centrally be addressing that, because I think that the most important thing today, at this moment, for the Sri Lankan people and state concerns what are the options that might be available now. So let me share my screen, and I will go through some of the data, and I hope that those of you who find data a reason to go to sleep will not entirely do so. I'll try to tell a little bit of a story, if I could, with this in mind. If I can find out how to do that, which may be, I see, more of a challenge than I had realized. Okay, let's start with desktop. Maybe that's what I have to do. Right. Can you see a graph which is called current account balance? Excellent. All right. So this is a bit of a background to the current situation. The current account balance tells us, broadly speaking, something about the foreign exchange resources which are going out as opposed to coming in to Sri Lanka on account of trade and debt payments and so on. And you can see that it has been chronically negative. This is a graph going back to 1975, chronically negative, but there has been a turn for the worse, beginning in the last 2 decades, and in particular, there was a real dip around 2010 with some improvement thereafter, but a worsening situation in terms of the resources that are going out as compared to coming in. Now, when a country faces a situation of this kind, there are 2 things that it can do. It can spend down the assets that it already has, if it has such assets, foreign exchange assets in particular, and it can acquire them from elsewhere. Now, you can see, if we go to this next graph on net trade in goods, that this is the trade balance, which reflects the import bill and the export bill, the excess of imports over exports. That Sri Lanka has also had a worsening trade balance, especially in the last decade, but it has also been chronically negative. Not as dramatically negative previously, but also chronically negative. But this has been partly papered over by inflows of various kinds. One of them is foreign direct investment, which you can see has also substantially increased, had substantially increased in this period, in the last 2 decades, prior to recent sharp downturn from 2018 to 2020. I think one of the things we have to understand is that Sri Lanka was one of those countries which it seems had been banking on being a darling to foreign investors, or at least sufficiently attractive to foreign investors to draw in investment inflows that would allow it to pay for the outflows on account of imports and interest payments. Now, Ahilan had previously mentioned Sri Lanka's Article 4 consultation from March, and with the IMF, which is a periodic consultation that the IMF undertakes with countries. And I unfortunately now I see my skills become a bit of a problem here. All right, here we go. I hope you can now see something that says Table 1, Sri Lanka's selected economic indicators. If not, let me know, Basuki. But in this table, from the IMF Article 4 consultation with Sri Lanka, you will see that the growth situation in Sri Lanka did not noticeably deteriorate. The growth rate between 2018 and 2022, the top line.
We just see a small excerpt, it looks like, from the tables rather than the, okay, perfect. Now we see the whole thing.
You see the whole thing, okay. There's something here called primary balance, and that's what I'd like you to focus on, okay? Primary balance, this is 2018 to 22. I hope you can see primary balance. In 2018, it was positive, 0.6. We don't know the prior history, it's not included in this table. But thereafter, it becomes negative. Now, what is the primary balance and why does it matter? This is really a crucial question. I'm now going to close this off and go back to, I hope, where I was. The primary balance reflects the extent to which the government is relying on borrowing to meet its current expenditures, even after interest payments are taken into account. In other words, if Sri Lanka were to default completely on its debt, which is an option, of course, for any country, which might even seem to be an attractive option because it would then free it from having to make large payments to foreigners, which are, one might think, repressing its consumption. Actually, the existence of a primary balance indicates that that would not necessarily help. A primary deficit, excuse me. The existence of a primary deficit indicates that would not necessarily help because the country is still relying upon ongoing foreign lending in order to meet its expenditures, right? Net of interest payments. So the elimination of the interest payments would not necessarily help it. In fact, if a country were to default, it would be, in this situation, were to default, it would be forced into what's called a hard landing. It would have to reduce its expenditure. In this case, we saw the government expenditure, the primary deficit was around 2 or 3%. It would have to reduce its expenditure in order to continue, assuming that there was no additional lending as a consequence of the default. That is to say, new lending stopped as a consequence of the default. Right. And you can see this is the Sri Lankan Treasury's fiscal strategy. That one of the elements in that strategy, number 7, is achieving primary surplus by 2025 and beyond, which is not necessarily an ambitious target. Now, if you ask the question, why did in Greece Yanis Varoufakis come to power with Syriza on a platform of, if necessary, repudiating its debt, but in fact, he and the party, in effect, did a volte-face and made an agreement with the troika of creditors. The reason, I think, is that the alternative was a hard landing, which would in some ways have been even more painful for Greece. And by negotiating ongoing financing, it was able to avoid that and to ensure that there was the ability to continue expenditures at a higher level than would otherwise be the case. Anna has already mentioned that in Sri Lanka, there is, of course, in addition to the foreign debt, considerable domestic debt. The red line is foreign debt here. The blue line is domestic debt. Green line, total public debt. So you can see that they have both been present, not necessarily increasing dramatically, but being high and increasing. Okay. The maturity structure of the debt stock. This is another potential degree of freedom because negotiations with creditors can involve changing the maturity, thereby effectively giving more room for payment without it necessarily being considered technically a default, as I understand it. So again, the lawyers may have more to say on this issue. So you can see that for Sri Lanka, about 40% of the debt is of longer maturities, 10 years plus, which is to say 60% of the debt has fairly short maturities, which is potentially dangerous for the country in the sense that as soon as that debt has expired, new borrowings would be required on potentially very damaging terms at higher interest rates, for example, in order to substitute for it. Anna mentioned that, and this is very, very important in Sri Lanka's case, and a key part of my own, I think, argument here, is that Sri Lanka's borrowings are now, in a considerable measure, from private commercial creditors. So you will see that as of April 21, according to this chart, 47% of the borrowings were so-called market borrowings, and those were mainly on the international bond market, not from commercial banks, as might have been the case in the 1970s, or thereafter to some extent, but from the sovereign bond market through bond issuance, which is something new for many developing countries. And it's one of the factors in the current debt crisis in Sri Lanka, but also the debt crises that have been emerging in certain other countries, such as Ghana, for example, which are very different from the past, because these countries simply did not have access to market borrowings previously, and this is therefore a new factor in the 2000s. And let me just show you, if I can, how that has changed. So this is Sri Lanka's foreign debt composition, 2004 to 19. You can see how much commercial borrowings have increased as a percentage of the total borrowings, okay, over time. And now if you look at the international debt statistics of the World Bank for Sri Lanka, and I'm sorry this will be too small for you to see, but I'm just going to read it to you, so you might have to take my word for it that there is such a graph. You can Google it, or a table, you can Google it yourself if you want. If you look at the evolution of Sri Lanka's debt between 2012 and 2020, you'll see that the debt to private creditors, as we also saw previously, increased tremendously from 7 billion to about 16 billion. But of that, which is more than a doubling, of that, the largest growth was in bonds from 4 billion to 14 billion, so more than a tripling. Okay. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Much of this debt is owned by large private firms, which you may or may not be familiar with, such as BlackRock, Ashmore Group, Allianz, UBS, HSBC, JP Morgan Chase, Prudential. Okay. Now, this is a chart of the price of a particular issue of Sri Lanka's bonds, which was from 2016. It's a 10-year bond. And at the time it was issued, it had of course, the price here is normalized. Price was 100. And now you can see it's 30. So roughly 30, 31. So there is, it's trading at 30 cents on the dollar. And the other side of this is that the yield has gone up from, which is to say the interest rate, which is effectively payable from the standpoint of investors, was 6.6% roughly at the beginning. And now it has moved up to almost 50%. So a new investor purchasing this bond, if Sri Lanka doesn't default on this particular bond, stands to recoup a tremendous amount just from those interest payments. Now, those of you who are lawyers, such as Tony and Anna, may know this name. This is a Bloomberg article on restructuring guru Lee Buchheit, who is a lawyer, a veteran of many debt restructurings, who's been consulted by the Sri Lankan government. And this article talks about how he's very concerned about the fact that Sri Lanka could be subject to potential holdouts, threats from holdouts who might refuse to accept the terms of any restructuring and demand full repayment of the par value of the bond, and may seek in court to ensure this, as happened infamously with Argentina in the case of the so-called vulture fund Elliott Management, which succeeded in doing that in New York to the considerable cost of Argentina. Now, as you may know, in the last decades, since the Asian crisis in 1997 and even more so subsequently, there has emerged an interest in what are called collective action clauses in bonds, which make it harder for there to be minority holdouts because they require that all of the holders of bonds would be subject to any agreement that's reached with sufficient proportion of bondholders. And Buchheit has pointed out that in the case of Sri Lanka, there are collective action clauses for a number of the bonds, but not for all of them. And also, it turns out there are some highly technical issues that arise with respect to the nature of these collective action clauses and the particular conditions under which bondholders are bound by them. This is what's referred to here as single limb and two limb aggregation, which has to do essentially with whether it's just the voters who are defined by the holders of a particular bond issued in a particular year at a particular time, or all bond holders who are relevant to determining whether a collection action clause is activated. And his view is that Sri Lanka is potentially vulnerable to such holdouts, which raises the question of what kind of legal arguments it could make if it is faced with that situation, but also what kind of public relations arguments it can make to make it harder for vulture funds to do this sort of a position. Okay. Now, of course, all of this is happening in the context of the absence, long time, chronic, as I mentioned, absence of a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, which would provide a rule of law for sovereign debt in the international context, some type of background norms or rules or laws which define how it is that debt is to be restructured in a crisis or an emergency. For instance, the relative preference that is to be given to different kinds of debtors, the extent to which a country can expect concessions due to humanitarian or other considerations that may play, that perhaps ought to play a role. That has been entirely lacking, and as a result, we have a situation where decade after decade, such emergencies are resolved on an ad hoc basis. And this is an example of an argument by, in this case, by Joseph Stiglitz and Martin Guzman, until recently, the finance minister of Argentina, calling for a set of principles in this regard, but they're not the only ones to have done so. The call for such a rule really transcends, I think, political perspectives to some extent, because Anne Kruger, for instance, when she was at the IMF, a very market-friendly economist, as many would know, was a person who advocated a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, and that has never emerged, which raises the question whether it's in the interests of creditors not to have one. Okay, but that's not going to help Sri Lanka in the short run. The absence of such a mechanism, which means that Sri Lanka will have to make arguments or identify policies that are available to it, which can make that difference. So let me mention in this connection a couple of things. The first is that Sri Lanka receives very large level of remittances from its external population as compared to many other countries. Worldwide, remittances received as a percentage of GDP are less than 1%, 0.8%. If you look at the countries which receive the most remittances as a percentage of GDP, there are, of course, some which are superpowers in this respect, Tonga with 39%. But Sri Lanka is also has a very respectable level of remittances, 8.8%. So that's roughly 10 times the worldwide average. And it raises the question as to whether Sri Lanka can, for instance, try to drum up a much higher level of remittances in the short run through special initiatives or programs which provide concessions or attractions to non-resident Sri Lankans, as some other countries have done. India, for instance, in the 1991 crisis, created such a bond. It was not heavily subscribed, but it was an initiative, I think, of an interesting kind. And Butch Montes, I believe, is in the audience. I understand the Philippines has done similar things, perhaps. So there may be models to look at in that regard. Now, let me just also note that historically, and Anna also mentioned this, the IMF policy has been that it will not lend to a country that has not achieved some type of an agreement with its bilateral official creditors, if it is a country that's debt has been judged to be unsustainable. So it would first have to make an agreement with its bilateral official creditors, which is to say other governments that have lent to it, in order to enter onto a sustainable debt path, or potentially to be able to enter onto a sustainable debt path as a precondition to the IMF lending to the country. And of course, those creditors were, in the past, generally those that belonged to the so-called Paris Club, which were the Euro-American governments, public lenders, official lenders. And the Paris Club does not include, notably, India and China, as it does not include a number of the other so-called new donors and new lenders, which makes it a problematic framework. As a consequence, or problematic norm to continue to have. As a consequence, in part, of that, but also as a consequence of the Greek crisis, in which the IMF, for political reasons perhaps, was forced to change its traditional restrictions on lending so as to be able to lend to Greece. It adjusted its policy on arrears to official creditors And it's really very interesting what it did. It did this in 2015, I believe. And it specified 3 criteria for being able to lend to a country, even if there is no, quote, adequately representative Paris Club agreement, and even if the debtor has been unable to reach agreement with one or more official bilateral creditors. The IMF can now still approve financing for a country if 1, there's a need for prompt IMF support, however judged, 2, the debtor is making good faith efforts to reach an agreement with creditors, and 3, the decision to provide financing would not have an undue negative effect on the IMF's ability to mobilize official financing packages in future cases. So it seems to me that Sri Lanka certainly can argue number 1. It very probably can argue number 2, depending upon how it approaches negotiations, and it very possibly can argue number 3. Okay. How should we think about IMF's, Sri Lanka's negotiating options and posture generally? I think something that's both bad and good for Sri Lanka is that it is not too big to fail, right? That is bad for Sri Lanka because it means that the IMF doesn't have to save it from the standpoint of stabilizing the global economy, achieving systemic stability, or even from other points of view, such as avoiding humanitarian disasters, since it may be thought that what happens in Sri Lanka is not going to be a headline issue globally. Of course, that judgment could be wrong. And what Sri Lanka does can in part influence that judgment. But the other side of this is that the fact that Sri Lanka is not too big to fail allows it potentially some degrees of freedom to argue that a creatively structured agreement with the IMF, which maximizes Sri Lanka's advantage, can be brought about without necessarily having adverse consequences for the fund, or perhaps setting a precedent which it would like to avoid. And I think that in this, it's going to be all important what kinds of arguments are made, especially externally by the country. And I think the focus should really be less on the IMF as the enemy and more on the question of how Sri Lanka can make a deal with the IMF which is least adverse, most positive for the people of Sri Lanka, in particular in terms of enhancing its negotiation posture vis-a-vis private bondholders and ensuring that they accept considerable concessions. So let me stop there. I hope I haven't gone on for too long. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sanjay. And certainly that's one place to start. What is the least worst situation that can be negotiated with different parties? So I think I'll, they've already have been, I was originally going to ask questions to give people time to formulate their own questions, but actually we already have a really nice collection of questions that I think are on many people's minds already in the chat. So maybe I'll go directly to some of them. In the meantime, Sanjay, I think there was a request for that you share some of those, the links. So if it's possible for you also to post some of those in the chat. That would be great. So let me just go directly to some of these questions. So there's one question from Sarala Emmanuel. So I'll read out. She began with the reference that Tony had made to the predominantly women's debt in the North and East coming out of microfinance and so on. And she says, in relation to your example of predominantly women's debt in the North and East in the post-war context, we as women's networks in the East were part of a strong mobilization and calls for debt cancellation. Similarly, what are your thoughts on the call for debt cancellation nationally and internationally? So I think anyone?
I welcome everyone else's comments as well. I think we have to look at the way in which the debt originated in many of these cases. So for many developing countries, they were born into debt. It was a debt that was acquired or accumulated by their colonial powers. So there is a principle of international law called, the principle of state succession. In other words, whatever sovereign is in power, it inherits the debt, even after a change, it inherits the debt of its predecessor. That's a very powerful principle of international law. And so we find this odd situation, for example, after decolonization, where the countries that had been colonized and that had been subject to the debt which had been established by the colonizers were still required to pay the debt which the colonizers had established, as it were. So I think what is needed is really an understanding of that earlier issue of how did this debt accumulate in the first place. And it's very interesting to think about this rule about state succession as far as debt is concerned. And simply just the extraordinary difficulties that people are personally experiencing, which leads them. And so it is the cancellation of debt.
So does anyone else want to weigh in on this, or should we move to another question? Yeah, Anna, go ahead.
Just super briefly, and maybe I can answer one of the questions in the bargain. The question I have, and the struggle I'm sort of struggling at the moment, is after debt cancellation, what? Right? So there was a big wave of bilateral debt cancellation in the early aughts for the lowest income countries, and the day after they accumulated a ton more debt. So I think that the question that I'm struggling with really is there are all of these financing needs. We haven't even mentioned climate, for goodness sakes, right? Never mind the pandemic, that's immediate. How are all of these needs going to be financed, and why is it that they have to be financed with debt? And if they do have to be financed with debt, then who's going to be doing the lending, on what terms, how resilient is this debt stock going to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So I think that debt cancellation is a great thing from some, look, a clean slate is great. The question is, do we have a view of what happens the day after? And that is much, much more complicated, and the history is much more depressing there. And this goes to the question of debt as an instrument of power projection. I think it sort of came in, Hilan's remarks. If you're not paying your debt, you're cut off from more resources. You don't pay, you don't eat, right? So there are much more complicated explanations and structures, but the most basic is that. And which is also what makes debt a problematic instrument in some contexts. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Anna. I know Aylan and Sanjay want to jump in on this too, so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think, in addition to thinking of it as debt, I would also, think about this as the kind of new regime of financialized accumulation that Sri Lanka has been subjected to, right? We started floating these sovereign bonds, and I kind of echo what Tony said, under Mahinda Rajapaksa's rule. When he was talking about sovereignty, we started our first sovereign bond launch was in 2007, and then that's that steady rise, right? And the last 5 years under Ranil Wickremesinghe is when we floated about $12 billion in sovereign debt. Now the average interest rate, Sanjay put it up, is about 7.5%. These sovereign bonds have a maturity of 10 years. In 10 years' time, the interest payment is equal to the principal. So who's gaining from this, right? There's an international order here that is sucking out wealth from countries like Sri Lanka. I mean, there's a longer history of colonialism, but particularly the kind of era of neoliberalism and the more financialized liberalization that's come about. So now the whole question of, we would like to see debt cancellation or a complete repudiation of this kind of financing. But is the Sri Lankan government ready for it? Do we have a regime? This is not the 1970s when we were talking about a new international economic order, when there was the non-aligned movement where we could rely on other sources of support. So early this year, there was a debate in Sri Lanka, and I was part of it, on should we default or not? And it was kind of ironic that a Marxist like me would say, no, we should not default, right? For the reason that, are we ready to face the consequences? And that is what we are facing now. Negative 8% GDP growth, complete kind of shutdown of any kind of, are we willing to disconnect from the global financial system, however unequal it is? And these are, and do we have a regime and a state ready to take on that challenge is a big question. Now, Sanjay, just a clarification. 2018 was the first time we had a primary balance after decades. So that data point from where you start is not clear. So we've had a history of mismanagement, mainly because, and I think this is, I want to touch on kind of Anna's point also, that we have had regimes in power and establishment who are not interested in negotiating with the best case for the IMF. They are thinking in the interests of the West here, right? That's how I would put it. They're happy to go along with any condition. The contradiction here is between the regimes in power, the policy establishment, and the people. And they're willing to impose any amount of suffering on the people to even go along with global finance capital. That's the reality. So they will be even happy to go along with the international creditors to the great suffering of the people, because they want to continue with the status quo that has been there the last 15 years. There's no rethinking of it. So what are these? So there's no appetite for debt cancellation from our leadership, in the sense that then if you're calling for that, then you have to say, we don't want any more sovereign bonds in the future. We don't want commercial borrowings in the future, and look what's happened the last decade, but we are not ready for that. So the kind of comprador elite that we have, whether it's the ruling government or the opposition, they have a different kind of game plan. It's not about negotiations with the IMF or even the creditors, because if they had to go that route, then they'd have to think seriously about redistribution. Our revenues are 8% of GDP, right? Sanjay, you can think about that, right? And what country can run with 8% of GDP in revenues? Our expenditure is 20%, which is still low. You mentioned the foreign direct investment. If you look at foreign direct investment, 1.2, 1.6 billion US dollars is abysmally low, I would say. And of that, 60-70% is speculative investment in real estate. It's not even foreign direct investment that's creating employment in that sense. Our trade deficit last year, amidst this huge crisis, we were amply clear by 2020 we headed. 2021, our trade deficit was 9 billion US dollars. Right? 12 billion in export earnings, 21 in imports. You're not willing to touch the imports because that is the thinking of our elite and our policymakers, that they're happy to go along with trade liberalization and financial liberalization at any cost. Sorry, I took too long, but I wanted to kind of respond to some of those other issues as well.
Yeah, so no, next, Sanjay, thank you for all of those links. So maybe I'll put, before you respond, Sanjay, I could add two more questions from the chat to the on the table, which I think would be great if everyone can.
Actually, Vasaki, would you mind, because I can't remember, I won't be able to remember them, at least I won't.
Okay.
Could I just respond to this one?
Yes, go ahead.
Very,
okay.
I'll try to be brief, yeah? But let me just say that, look, of course, the political orientation of government is very crucial. What are the kinds of expenditures which are financed by debt, whether domestic or foreign? What kinds of efforts is the country making to tax anybody, including, of course, the well-off? I just shared in the chat a graph on Sri Lanka's tax to GDP ratio, where you can see how precipitately it's declined, whereas many other countries have increased their tax to GDP ratio in this period. So that was a major strategic error, it would seem, in terms of the economic management of the country that took place. And that has been going on for a decade. So there are questions of prudence. There are questions of whose side one is on, the class composition, as Aylan has put it, or orientation of the state, and so on. Yes, but it is also true that borrowing serves a purpose. And in this, I'm with Anna, and I'm sorry to say, not on the same side as Saint Graeber, much as I appreciate some of his arguments. But the idea that debt is the source of all evil, the original sin, so to speak, in particular, creditors are the source of all, the original evildoers, by pushing debt on people, I think it's a little bit of a simplification, because debt plays a role in financing projects which are worthwhile. I think even Aylan, you acknowledged, much as you said that the elites cannot be trusted to borrow. These elites cannot be trusted to borrow. You did seem to leave an opening for appropriate progressive state to appropriately progressive state to borrow responsibly for public ends. So I think that, you know, we really need to separate these discussions, at least keep them in mind as having some distinctions. The question of, you know, what kind of policy is responsible, sensible, progressive, inclusive in its goals, and what kinds of rules in the international system are appropriate. And in this regard, I would agree with Tony. You know, there is an original sin there, that the colonial regime and the neo-colonial, so to speak, circumstances that have followed from that have created an uneven playing field and have saddled many countries, even at their outset, with inadequate resources and structural circumstances that have forced them into a certain propensity to borrow, or a necessity to borrow, to maintain a development path, and which has made them fragile and vulnerable. And so I think we have to also ask, of course, whether debt and so-called aid really should be even or can be thought of with outside of this question, and of course, more broadly, issues of global justice or even of reparations that may arise in certain cases, such as that of Haiti, which Tony mentioned very clearly, but perhaps in other cases too. So I think, you know, we can talk about both of these things at once. I don't think we have to take the view that debt is the source of all evil, to see that debt is often very damaging when it's undertaken for the wrong reasons, in the wrong ways, in the wrong contexts. And I think if we do that, then we can approach this whole issue much more sensibly. And I agree with Anna also that a debt jubilee, you know, it's not a principled response. This is where, again, I'm a little bit different from Saint Graeber. There's no principled argument as to how and why a jubilee, a complete erasal of all debts once every few years, as he has advocated, would address the underlying structural circumstances. And it's also naive as to whether creditors would continue to lend in that situation, in that expectation.
Great. Thanks, Sanjay. So I think the questions that follow also actually build on this conversation. So it's a continuation rather than a new direction. So one of the questions, I think, Anna, it begins with you, but again, I think everyone will want to pitch in. And it's basically about the questions about how much leverage Sri Lanka has in negotiating with the IMF. And there are two related questions, one from Zora Ahmed. She says, Professor Gallatin, you mentioned maneuvers Sri Lankan authorities might have at disposal to negotiate a better agreement with the IMF. Can Sri Lanka realistically push back against the IMF's neoliberal conditionalities? Or in other terms, do you see any shift at the level of the IMF regarding conditionalities, or is conditionalities not a primary concern? So is there a change in IMF policy on conditionalities? And If so, is there, and if not, even, what is there leverage that Sri Lankan government can have? And then someone else, Nandini Manel Imbilagoda asks, IMF loans are paid from the money collected from increase in indirect taxes, typically making poor people poorer. Could the IMF loans be directed to revenue generating long-term projects, which is perhaps about, whether is that, it also brings in perhaps thinking about the role of the World Bank and of other donors as well, not just the IMF. But maybe we can, maybe, yeah, there's also a question, of course, of that the last two comments are about corruption used in creating the debt. So maybe it also brings up international law issues around odious debt and so on. So, Anna, why don't we begin with you, and then we can go around.
Okay. Famous last words. We'll again try to be brief. The first question is the biggest in terms of its implications. So going back to something Sanjay said, and I promise we've never been on a panel before as far as I can tell, so we're not coordinating. But the good and the bad thing is that Sri Lanka is not too big to fail. Right. So in that sense, it does not have the bargaining power of a Greece or even of an Argentina, which, thanks to its multiple engagements with the IMF, accounts for a huge chunk of the IMF's own asset books. So the IMF has very complicated stake in countries like Argentina, Greece, Ukraine that owe it a ton of money. There is no universe in which Sri Lanka would or should want to owe the IMF so much money that it has bargaining power over the IMF. Let's sort of stipulate that. On the other hand, the sovereign debt universe has transformed tremendously over the past roughly decade and change. And I'll put a link to an article in the chat where the creditors are a lot more diverse, dispersed, and really play by different rules. Certainly there's been an enormous amount of talk about China and the fact that it's not a member of the Paris Club, and whether the common framework for which Sri Lanka is not eligible is kind of a successor to this creditor coordination mechanism. But what's interesting is that the old, G7, Europe, North America, Japan, creditor coordination kind of node is not really the only game in town anymore, which means that countries, including countries that are economies that are relatively small or medium-sized, can play creditors off against one another. Now, hello to all my friends from the IMF in the ether out there. But, look, countries really have the option of walking away, and the established institutions are more than ever having to prove the case for their relevance and efficacy. And that's where I think that countries like Sri Lanka have bargaining power. And the fact that there's been an enormous amount of press about Sri Lanka being a, quote, canary in the coal mine, again, nobody ever used that again. That creates a certain PR leverage in Sri Lanka. It cannot be a high profile failure. And so I think that's really where it is. And recognizing this IMF conditionality has been evolving. And it has been a lot more sensitive to these kinds of concerns. Now, very, very briefly, IMF's mandate is not to finance projects, that's development banks, right? The IMF's mandate is balance of payments lending. So for better or worse, it lends to central banks, central government, and its loans take the form, take kind of a quirky form that would not lend itself to project financing, period. That said, the idea in theory is that the IMF lends to create an atmosphere where the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, private sector invests in revenue generating projects. That's the idea. Whether that's the extent to which it's reality, let's discuss. Finally, odious debt. I think Tony really highlighted that it's part of the state succession conversation in one sense, but in another sense, also it's about the extent to which normative questions of justice and use of proceeds in borrowing and monitoring, enter into debt enforcement and debt, authorization, debt validity, and all of those questions. And I think, ironically, the rise of, socially responsible ESG, whatever you want to call it, kind of fashion, whereas it's in many ways dubious, I think it pushes the conversation in the direction of accountable use of proceeds, and by implication, perhaps creating more hurdles to the enforcement of problematic debt. Thank you.
Great. Who else wants to jump in on that one? Sanjay, go ahead.
Thank you. I think that, as Anna has noted, IMF conditionality has evolved. I don't think we yet know enough to say whether the actions of the IMF on the ground have been or will continue to be entirely in keeping with their new rhetoric. But there certainly is a new rhetoric. And one simple example of that is in the debates that many of us followed way back in the 1980s and 90s, especially the 1980s. There was the suggestion that IMF conditionality caused, whether or not it intended to cause, sharp decreases in social expenditure. And that the IMF was blind, had been blind, improperly blind to this. This was what UNICEF charged in its adjustment with a human face, famously, for example. And debates raged about the question of to what extent that was the case, in fact, that social expenditures had diminished as a result of IMF conditionalities. But today, the IMF will say that they place conditionalities on social expenditure. Indeed, not that they should, not that social expenditures should not go above a certain level, but that they must not fall beneath a certain level, which is a radical turnaround, right? And notwithstanding the Articles of Agreement, which require that the IMF should not involve itself in political questions directly, and again, Tony spoke to that and knows much more about that. There are institutional and governance conditionalities that the IMF has regularly introduced into its recent programs in Argentina, for example, and elsewhere. So, of course, they make the argument that these are necessary for sound economic management. So there are, I think, ways in which one could imagine using that fact that the IMF would like to appear to be a different kind of organization to advantage. But let's ask the question, and I think, by the way, Anna made an excellent point there. Again, we're not coordinating, but made an excellent point that because Sri Lanka's high profile, its crisis is high profile, that also puts the IMF and other institutions to some extent under pressure to make sure that things go in a way that doesn't make them look entirely bad. Now, let's just ask the question: why does Sri Lanka need the IMF? I'm not sure, Ahilan, what is your proposal? I mean, would you prefer that Sri Lanka not form an agreement with the IMF? That is an option, as I mentioned, but it would lead to a hard landing because of the primary deficit, which is being run by the Sri Lankan government, and also because, of course, of the reliance on foreign exchange inflows, specifically to meet the import bill. So to the extent that that hard landing will be possibly more painful for Sri Lanka's people, as Syriza might have judged on the day that it turned around and repudiated its program immediately after being elected, that puts any Sri Lankan government, progressive or not, in a pickle. So I think that's point number one to be understood. You know, you may not like it, but it's a fact that if one doesn't have those new inflows of borrowing, then one would have to tighten one's belt very sharply as a result of not having the new inflows. There being a so-called sudden stop in the inflow of resources. Second, IMF resources come at an advantageous interest rate, currently about 1%. Contrast that with the 50% almost yield on Sri Lankan bonds that are being traded on the market. Can you imagine what a difference that is? Obviously, the Sri Lankan government cannot afford to pay 50%, even if it could afford to pay 6.75%, which it was the interest rate in 2016 that it was committing itself to. That would be very different from 1%. So let's keep these two facts in mind, right? We can slug off the IMF. I love to do it myself. I've done it plentifully. But from the standpoint of a finance minister, prime minister, cabinet, indeed a social movement, a progressive political party that wants to avoid the worst in the short run, what are the options before it? I think responsibility requires recognizing that much as we would, we have very good reasons to criticize the structure of the international financial system and call for something else, as I have done, a progressive form of sovereign debt resolution mechanism, appropriately contextualized in terms of global historical responsibilities. That is not going to save Sri Lanka from its immediate, the immediate adverse outcomes that it faces if it does not form an agreement of some kind with creditors. And as Anna said, the IMF has been historically the conduit to that. But of course, it can negotiate with all the creditors, and it should, right? But I don't think that a hard landing is a great option for Sri Lanka. But if that's the option you prefer, I think we should think about what it looks like.
Great. Thank you. So, Ahilan, you're next, and if I can add, in a sense, a different version of that same question that Nilu had posed very early on about thoughts on alternatives to typical IMF policies that Sri Lanka should and can adapt to come out of the crisis. And then finally, this, and maybe right at towards the end of our program, this comment by James Gatti, who says that Sanjay is too sanguine about the role of the IMF, and that there's a ton of stuff about about the timing of IMF's call for austerity, and that he links to a report that mentions how during the pandemic, especially its fiscal consolidation programs imposed austerity at the worst time for indebted countries. So
could I just briefly respond to that, which is, as a factual matter, Christine Lagarde called for countries to spend money during the pandemic. And so I don't know that that's quite right. I haven't looked at that IMF report, excuse me, that Oxfam report, but we can talk about that. And let me just be very clear. I'm not defending the IMF. I'm no friend of the IMF. I'm talking about hard choices that exist and how to deal with them.
Okay, so the link to that report is also in the chat. And Ahilan, you can jump in next, and I think Tony after you. Yeah.
I mean, the IMF, first of all, the IMF says many things. You remember in 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, the managing director said developing countries should consider a wealth tax, right? So they say many things, but there's also the rule of colonial deference of how they have double standards for countries. And it goes back to the question of, what is Sri Lanka standing internationally? And the rules do change all the time. There's nothing about a wealth tax in their staff report, but she did say that also. Now, to kind of Sanjay's question, Sanjay, we're already in a hard landing. 8%, negative 8% GDP growth, where poverty has doubled. We were following the IMF recommendations over the last 6 months, and the hard landing has already happened in my view. One, right? Two, what is the IMF in terms of resources going to give us? This can change. Of course, I do agree with both Anna and Sanjay that for various, the canary in the mine argument that they don't, there was suddenly a lot of interest in Sri Lanka 3-4 months ago, because if 50 other countries are going to default, it's in kind of the US's interest to figure out a way out, because then it's pointing to a whole crisis of the neoliberal order. And they might, if the US Treasury and the State Department decide that, throwing $20 billion at Sri Lanka is not a cost, it's a political decision. It can be over-determined politically if they wish. But the trajectory, I mean, but most analysts say what we are going to get from the IMF is 3 to 4 billion US dollars over a 3-year period, $1 billion US dollars per year. As I mentioned, our export earnings per month is 1.3 to 1.6 billion US dollars a year of foreign earnings, right? Now, what are we doing with that? So we have to make certain hard choices in Sri Lanka. Do we want to be able to import the kind of, between 2010 and 2020, we imported close to 10 billion US dollars worth of vehicles into the country, right? So we also floated 14 billion US dollars in sovereign bonds. So these are the kind of hard questions that have to be first debated within Sri Lanka before we ask about what to do with the IMF. At this point, it's come to a point where I think even if we wanted to go to the IMF is the one now dragging. They said they'll come in July, they said August, now December, January, right? Because we've lost all negotiating power. That's why I would say that the decision to default in April, which was pushed by the establishment, let's be frank, but it's our central bank governor, the secretary of the finance ministry, our Ranil Wickremesinghe, they are, I would say, more Washington consensus than probably the IMF in terms of the policies that they are pursuing. So for me, the kind of political question overdetermines it. As of now, the direction which we are going, if it means more austerity, I would say delay the IMF agreement, keep our options open, because the people can't just take any more austerity. We have to first start thinking about redistribution within the country. Thank you.
Great. Tony, do you want to jump into the
I know. So this has been a wonderfully rich exchange, I think, because we've got such an interesting range of ideas. I'm caught in a dilemma because I feel very hesitant about IMF programs. And yet I can't easily think of an alternative. So I have to consider more carefully what Ahilan has to say. Perhaps, I welcome the thoughts of Anna and Sanjay in terms of, how something might be done despite all the difficulties and the suggestions they make about how the IMF could be a resource that Sri Lanka needs. I don't know whether it's worthwhile thinking about the Asian financial crisis in 97, 98. Because we do find a situation in which the countries that were subject to very intrusive IMF packages seem to have recovered. And I don't know quite how that all worked out, or whether the circumstances that applied there. Every case is different, of course, but whether there's anything we can learn from that, or whether that that crisis is unique, or whether there are some connections that can be made. So those are just some thoughts. Thanks.
We are actually right at time at 2 o'clock. So at 11 o'clock 11 a.m. in New York, and I think 8:30 in Sri Lanka. So we've got 2 hours. Thanks so much for everyone for staying way past the 1.5 hours we had intended. And we had, of course, a rich debate. There's so much both on the table and things that we need to, I think, the debate and the issue that we need to clearly discuss further. So we will definitely have another, at least one more session. One of the things that we are considering is doing something that's a comparative discussion of the experience of different countries in similar crises, negotiating with the IMF. So in fact, James Gathi, who intervened in the chat, is part of a group of African economists and lawyers involved with this discussion. And so so I've already spoken to James about trying to organize something with his advice. And so we'll do that. We'll do that next. So we'll keep you posted. And Thanks once again to the translators for really heroic efforts translating all of this, and to our wonderful panelists and everyone in the Women and Media Collective team. Thank you.